everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. Today from the Fruitmarket Gallery in Edinburgh, where I'm going to be talking to writer Helen McClory. We're going to be talking about her new collection of short stories, Mayhem Death, which has just been published by 404 Inc., along with a debut collection, again, on the Edges of Vision. But before we talk about anything else, I want to say hello, Helen.
Hello, Alistair.
And thanks for coming along and doing this.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
So let's start at the beginning of your kind of life as a writer. How did you first decide that this was what you were going to do?
Well, I always wrote wee stories and things as a child and just loved it, but I didn't really think of it as an option for a career. And I just kept, writing away, and mostly writing poems when I was an adolescent, poems that nobody should ever see.
Yes, we've all got those, I think.
But then I sort of decided I wanted to do a creative writing master's and to try my hand at writing and see if it was something I could make a go of. I never thought, A, I'll be published, or B, that I could make a career out of that even if I was published. But I just felt like I had maybe an ability and I wanted to try. So I did a master's in creative writing at the University of New South Wales in Sydney.
Right.
And it went really well, and it was really innovative and interesting, and it gave me all these kinds of exciting ideas that I hadn't come across, because I did an undergraduate from St Andrews in English literature and classical studies,
right,
which was a good grounding, but very traditional, as you can imagine.
Yes.
So this was like exploding the world. And after that I thought, I haven't learned enough about how to write, so I'll try and do a PhD. And I was lucky enough and privileged enough that I could do a PhD in creative writing, which I did at University of Glasgow. And after that I was like, right, well, I have the stamina.
Yeah, I've got this far. I'm
going to just keep trying. And I tried to get the book published that I wrote for the PhD. It was an unsuccessful attempt,
yes,
but I felt, well, at every stage you have to tell yourself, I've come this far, so I'll just keep writing, keep going, see how far I can push along. And then I finished at Glasgow, went to New York, and then started writing another novel that would eventually be Flesh of the Peach,
yes,
which took me a long time to write and perhaps longer to get published.
Okay.
So it was actually written before my debut collection.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and caused me no end of grief and knocks. So I'm a good one to ask if you're feeling bad about your career as a writer. I've got so many stories
Scars,
of rejection. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, why Sydney for doing your time there?
I just, my mother was a 10-pound pom. She moved to Australia in the 70s, and so I'd always heard stories of how amazing Australia was. So I really wanted to go there, and I did it, and it was a fantastic place, but so far away.
Yeah.
I couldn't sustain life out there, and there wasn't any funding to do a PhD, which would have been very expensive.
Sure.
So come back after that.
Yeah. And the PhD at Glasgow, I think people are kind of quite interested in what that entails, because for a lot of people, it's, I suppose, a bit like any kind of literary PhD, but how do you mark something that's creative in that way? Yeah,
I still don't fully know, and I had my Viva. I think it's just, with the combo of doing a creative piece and a selection of essays to talk about your own work, I think they can judge you from that, to see that you've gone in with a plan and you've got your influences listed and then shown how you've kind of led up to this, then they can kind of do it from there. For me, the essay part was the absolute hardest. It was absolute murder to write essays on my own stuff.
Sure.
But also I really just went to my influences and did it from there. It was very, very hard work for a PhD. And I had the idea that I might go into academia afterwards. I no longer have that idea, really.
Yes.
I do not have that type of mind. I have a...
What dissuaded you from that?
I think the size of creative writing department jobs, I guess, like the number of jobs in Scotland being so small and so competitive.
Sure.
And also it's quite traditional.
Yes.
And I knew that I was writing and interested in stuff that is deeply weird, literary, but not from the canon necessarily, or neglected from the canon or peripheral. So I never felt like I could participate in the conversation that was being had, and I also felt a bit stupid compared with a lot of academics that I met. So that's two sides of that coin there.
That's really interesting, because I think there is this belief, rightly or wrongly, that, as you say, the writing courses can be quite traditional. They're often run by people who are creative but also academics as well, almost a joint background. So therefore they may produce similar writers coming through them. Now, I would say you're an example of that not happening, but what's your feeling on that?
I think that everybody who goes into these programs is an individual, so they will get what they can from it. And I don't say that tradition is bad at all. I mean, what would we have if we didn't pay attention to the works that have gone before and have been so amazing? But I do think there needs to be perhaps just a strain more weirdness and an experimentation, just to help people realise the fullness of what they can go for. Give them permission.
Yes, absolutely.
Because seeking your own permission is really hard and full of self-doubt.
Yeah.
So maybe things would have gone a bit smoother for me after if I'd had that a wee bit more of that.
So how do you feel now about the first novel that was actually your PhD piece?
Well, I still like it as in what I could do then, and I think it's always good to be generous to your past self and the limit of the abilities you had then. But I was trying so hard to write in a traditional form for that PhD, and it was agonising to do.
Yes.
And I don't know, I think the work is good, but numerous publishers and agents who've seen it said it's too quiet.
That's interesting. Really interesting. And the viva for a PhD in creative writing, is it almost like an editorial meeting? Is it almost like people sitting there going, well, I like this, but if you do a bit of that, or if you take out that, I mean, how does that work?
With my Viva, no, it was, I came in with my PhD thesis stuck full of all these notes about what I could defend, like, this creative choice was because of this, and this bit of this, and then in the end it was like, your essays need this little bit of work, and the book, that's okay. All right,
well, that's okay.
Yeah, so I was quite lucky in that regard.
So, moving on from that, you put the original novel out to publishers, and as you say, got a few scars from that. And then you went to New York, did you say?
Yes, I went to New York and lived there for a year and a half.
Right.
Worked as a dog walker.
Okay.
And I've told many people this story, so forgive me if you've maybe heard it, but while there I was Lou Reed's dog walker.
Wow.
That's my one famous encounter.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
What kind of dogs does Lou Reed have?
He had a dog called Lola Bell, and there's actually a documentary about her by Laurie Anderson, Lou Reed's partner. She was kind of a Parson Russell Terrier.
I forgot Laurie Anderson, yeah.
And she was very elderly when I looked after her, so she didn't really want to be walked very much. But yeah, so that was a great bit. But New York itself was so hard, and it gave me such a respect for immigrants because they actually managed to do it, and I was an immigrant who just failed. So I thought, well, I'm not very good at this. I wrote a novel about failing to immigrate properly.
Well, I think since you wrote Flesh of the Peach before On the Edges of Vision, we'll start by talking about Flesh of the Peach. Because as you say, it begins in New York.
Yes.
And it is someone who, well, two of the kind of greatest things that could happen to you, the most traumatic things that happen to you happen, and then it's how she then deals with that. So if you could explain a little bit about Flesh of the Peach.
Yes, in Flesh of the Peach it follows Sarah Brown, who is living in New York kind of on the fringes of surviving. She has just broken up with the married woman that she was having an affair with. Well, the married woman broke up with her in a rather traumatic way. And she's also just learned that her mother, from whom she was estranged, has died and left her all her money, basically.
Which is a lot.
Which is a lot, because she was a kind of sentimental painter of rather tedious watercolors, whereas Sarah is trying to be an experimental artist.
Yes.
And so instead of trying to face her grief and process her feelings, she goes, oh, I'll just go and move to the cabin that my mother has given me, away from everybody, and just try and push forward and ignore everything. And then she just proceeds to do that and travels to New Mexico, where she messes up her life and other people's lives for a bit.
It's there's flashbacks to Cornwall as well, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got this movement and these different places, very distinct places. And I was wondering, and now knowing that you spent time in New York, that I might have an idea of the answer to this, but where the places kind of drove the story, to what extent?
Well, New York was very central to that, to driving it, to causing the difficulties, because it's such a difficult place to live. It's really hard, really fast, really expensive, really grueling, and New York tells itself this story of being hard and fast and the best. It
prides itself in it.
It does. So I wanted to see how this woman would, with no real preparation, would cope, and that changed, how she is and dictates her way of moving in this horrible place. It just it's not horrible. New York's not horrible. Her, like, the aura around her is difficult, and it makes everything that bit more difficult. So then I wanted to have New Mexico in it, because I did this for research. I traveled to New Mexico because I had the idea of it being the place that she would go, because its tagline as a state is the land of enchantment.
Right. Wow.
That's the actual tag that they use. So I was like, and I'd heard stories about how beautiful it was and how completely different it would be to New York, but different again from Cornwall. So it's this, New Mexico is arid and starkly beautiful and varied and rich, and it has an amazingly long history too, which I didn't really know before I went. So I made the journey that's in the book by bus.
I often thought it was a bit like a kind of weird take on Alice in Wonderland, where she meets really odd and destructive characters when she gets there. And it's interesting that you were going to travel there to kind of experience where it was for yourself. And do you think that's important?
Absolutely. I would have hardly any idea of how New Mexico would be. I mean, the only thing I could do is do dry research or look at it on Google Maps, but you can't get the taste of the air. You can't, smell the fried food. You can't.
And I think that's in the book. All those things are in the book. Absolutely, the sense of place for all three places that are mentioned are so strong. I mean, I've been visiting New York briefly, and that idea of getting on a bus even is slightly terrifying. And then kind of heading to somewhere that you don't really know in terms of New Mexico is a huge move. But then her mind is kind of so consumed with guilt, anger, betrayal, all sorts of things that, in fact, at that time, probably a bus journey to somewhere you don't know makes perfect sense. Is that running away?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And running away is a great sort of structure for a story. I think, how many stories are about running away secretly?
The relationship that breaks up in New York, it's agonising, because to me it's a relationship that she has invested real hopes and dreams, but probably deep down knows it's not going to last because of the structure of it. And that kind of sets up her character in a way that she'll go into things, invest them with real, probably too much hope, and then when they crumble down, it's devastating. Yeah,
I think I wanted that for the character. It really lets you know that she isn't a hard person, that she's not invulnerable, because she might seem at first very aggressive and maybe definitive, but she has this kind of naivety and nuance that I wanted not to allow readers to love her, because they're trying not to, but to let them see her vulnerabilities. And I think that's important, especially for readers who are open to that idea. And I think that's one of the functions of literature, is to allow you to see other lives and to allow yourself to feel for them as well as to feel them. Whereas you might push them away, make your judgments.
Yeah.
It sets you right in that mind. Yeah.
I was at a film showing of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie last night, and I think Jean Brodie's the classic example, or a classic example of that. You know, where you would probably, if you met her, run a mile from her, but yet Spark manages to get real sympathy for this character who is destroying lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's. I mean, nobody is a villain outright, so it's so worth doing that.
In fact, the dedication at the beginning is for unlikable women in fiction.
Yes, and to Miss Brodie as well. You know.
Say a little bit more about the relationship between Sarah and her mother, because that's a really interesting one. You know, again, there's a sense of betrayal. They're estranged, as you say. Her mother's been very successful. She, at the moment, is not successful. So what ideas did you have behind that relationship?
It was an interesting one to me because it's not coming from any biographical sense. It was just purely about the idea of creating things and how to be an artist in the world, and the idea of creating yourself, which is an American idea, versus the reality of creating in the legacy that you always have. The idea that you have family and you have role models and you have duties that are always pressing on you. So I wanted to kind of explore that idea. Sarah's mother, she came out so clearly formed as a sort of very particular kind of a person who really tries hard and is also unlikable in her own way.
Right.
That perhaps, she's some sort of aspect of Sarah as well. They are intricately entwined as these things. One could not exist without the other, perhaps.
Right.
And I was just very interested to see how that would give you a character who was layered with all these guilty feelings and difficulties, not just on the personal level, the incident that causes her to be estranged from her family,
yes,
but also in the artistic sense, like you'll never be free to be considered on her own terms.
Yes, she'll always be considered her mother's daughter.
Yes, exactly.
You said there about America being a land where individual success is really championed.
Yeah.
And in this book there are lots of people who some would say have failed and are therefore almost invisible to other people in the book. That's quite a strong line through it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something I found on the journey that I took by bus to research in New Mexico. The Greyhound bus never stops in the affluent areas of town. Never stops near anywhere where you can get a hot plate of food. Everybody you see is a marginal. Almost everybody's a marginal. And you really get that sense that this is what people would think of the underclass. But they're human beings and they're living their lives, and you get in close proximity you get to feel the real feelings of their lives and the stories of their lives. And you can't do anything but kind of respect them for working so hard and trying so hard to live, while their society dictates that they have failed.
Yeah. It becomes about survival.
It does. They're surviving.
You almost do anything to keep surviving. I think having been warned off against taking buses over long areas in America, I can understand that that's what people almost expect. I was once going to get a Greyhound bus from Los Angeles to, I can't remember where it was now I'm going to, and was warned off by the person who was going to be booking the tickets, going, no, you don't want to be getting on that bus. At least we're outside the prison for a start. And I'm going, I'm sure I'll be fine. And they persuaded me eventually not to take it.
Oh, you should have just ignored them.
I know I should have done, absolutely.
But it is really a difficult experience sometimes, because there were ex-prisoners on the bus as well. I was on. And
yeah, why not?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, they've got to go places too.
Yeah, everyone's got to go places. But it was interesting that even people who are selling the tickets were kind of going, are you sure you want to do this?
It's terrible. I mean, dismissing their own, people who use the buses, their own clientele. Yeah.
So, Flesh of the Peach was published after On the Edges of Vision. Finally got published. You said it took a long time for someone to pick it up.
Yeah, 4 years.
Well, so you kept in there.
I kept in there, yeah, for reasons of my own, I guess, like stubbornness.
I'm interested, and I don't want to bring back any bad memories, but so how many rejections kind of have you got that now? How many people are you sending it out to?
Gosh, 30 at least.
Oh, wow.
Agents and small publishers, lots.
And do you get people saying this is good, but we don't know where it's going to... We're going to put it. I mean, what was the reasons for rejection?
When I did get reasons, and you don't always.
Yeah, sure, of course.
People said, there's a couple of good ones where they said, you don't really know how to write, and you should ask your friends, like people who referred me on or whatever, for some tips.
Oh, wow.
There was some really brutal stuff there. And even after it was published, I sent it to a bookseller who said, this book has no themes.
Wow.
I felt nothing reading this. There's a lot. I mean, almost always I remember the more difficult ones.
Of course. I think it's quite interesting going back to what you said about doing the PhD. And I'm wondering if as selling of books becomes more and more difficult, as people are perhaps less prepared to take risks, that if you don't fit into, say, well... It's not crime fiction. I think selling literary fiction is more and more difficult, without doubt. And someone who takes chances, which you do in your writing, or does new things, perhaps that becomes even more difficult because people just goes, well, we don't know where to put this.
I absolutely think that's it. And I think especially if you're writing already with things like a female protagonist and an unlikable female protagonist, and the structure is difficult, and you know, that makes it really hard. And the fact that it was set in America and about an English person maybe made it fall through between two stools.
Yeah.
As you make these little extra hybrid steps, then that adds to the difficulty, I think.
Yeah.
And I understand it. I mean, people are under so much pressure, and I respect all the small presses who are doing that work and doing that legwork to push out what they can. You know?
But I just think if people have learned nothing from the history of publishing or the history of writing, it's the ones which are different that do take chances that in the end people really remember.
Yeah.
When we were talking about Alistair Gray before we started recording, imagine someone getting Lanark on their desk and going, what the hell do we do with them?
I'm sure somebody did.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And probably just gave up after a couple of pages or something. But yeah, and wouldn't be able to see the brilliance of that book.
Yeah.
That book is one of my favourites. I think that's the case, and it always will be, that people, if you don't know what it is, then you can't talk about it, then you can't put it in your editorial meeting, you can't champion it. So they just go, oh, it's a lot of effort, and they've got so much work on their plate anyway.
So while Flesh of the Peach was sitting waiting to be noticed, you did On the Edges of Vision, which was your first collection of short stories. So how did you go about that then? Why decide to go down the short story? Or was it a collection of things you'd already written and they were elsewhere?
I had two stories to begin with, and they were flash fiction, really short. And I went away to a residency in Banff in Canada. I had an amazing time there. Came back, wrote some rubbish that I just binned, but came back, and shortly after that sat down and was like, well, I have these two stories, why don't I write something in a theme of monstrous humanity?
Yeah.
So I wrote the almost all of the rest in 6 weeks.
Wow.
Apart from the final two, which not final two, they're somewhere in the middle, on a holiday when I was in Iona. So it came out very, very fast. And then I thought, well, this is something. Might as well try and send it to some small presses. And I sent it to two, and one of them was like, what's this? Because they're Scots words, and it was an American publisher.
Right, okay.
I get it. And then the other one, which was Queensferry Press, was run by a woman who was born in Scotland, and she could sort of got that cross-language issue. And she was like, oh yeah, we'll put that out.
Oh, wow.
And took a real risk on it. And it was wonderful. And that's how that got out, very, very fast, completely different to Flesh of the Peach. Almost no resistance, almost no upsetting emails.
And won Salter First Book of the Year as well, I mean, which is really incredible.
It really is. I'm still shocked that it did so well.
This thing of winning prizes, does that really make a difference? Does it really help?
Massively,
yeah,
absolutely massively. I don't think Flesh of the Peach would have been published without winning that and meeting Freight's Eye, for better or worse.
Yes.
And for other people to take me seriously. As someone who's working in the margins on weird stuff, winning that really made a difference. Absolutely.
And did you probably didn't have that many expectations of it beforehand.
No.
How did it change your expectations of being a writer then after, winning prizes and being published and people talking about it?
Well, it didn't change it too much. I've got a very sort of realistic outlook that, well, I published this one, doesn't mean the next one's going to be published. Just got to keep plugging away. And I'm very, very happy and grateful that it won what it won. I don't expect to win another prize again, but the fact that I did is very encouraging in the darker moments where I'm like, is this any good with my stuff?
What I think was now the Saltaire First Book of the Year is literally that, isn't it? It could be for anything, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So the fact that a collection of short stories won it itself, I think, is very interesting.
And it shows that they're very open to different forms, and I respect that a lot. And you don't see that very often.
No, absolutely. I mean, I still think it's a form of writing that gets overlooked. Like if it's a well-known writer, it's like, I'm now doing short stories. It happened recently with James Kelman's latest, where people say, he's doing that between the novels.
It's so annoying.
I know, absolutely, I know. I mean, I think James Kelman's best writing is his short story writing. But there is this attitude. People say, I love fiction, and then you say, have you read, Muriel Spark's short stories, and they go, no, I haven't. You think, man, you're just missing out on so much.
I bet I haven't read any of her short stories too, and I'm missing out because she's so good.
She came to notice with her first, the Seraphin Zambezi won a prize, and it was the first one that she put in, and that's how she kind of came to prominence, was through short story writing.
Okay.
Again, set in Africa where she was living at the time. So
I should absolutely check that out.
So, On the Edges of Vision, and then Flesh of the Peach does get picked up. And you just said there, for better or for worse. You should explain to people who don't know, it was picked up and published by Freight, and then just after it was published, pretty much, Freight was no more.
Yep. So now Flesh of the Peach is kind of no more as well.
Yeah, and that's it, is it?
Yep. Well, until another publisher makes, a generous offer to put it out again.
Well, if anyone listening, it's there, it's already done, it's easy.
I've got the rights.
It's easy.
Yeah.
So the themes that are in Flesh of the Peach were kind of spoken about grief and art and desire, and they kind of run through a lot of your work as well. So let's move on to Mayhem Death, which is the latest book. Short fiction again, as you see, some flash fiction, very short, a page length. Is this more of a collection of things that you'd written elsewhere, or again, was it something that you sat down and wrote through?
I'd been writing for the sort of 2 years between On the Edges of Vision and now. I just been always writing flash fictions here and there, putting them out, getting them published, just enjoying that work without much pressure. And then I got the rights back to On the Edges of Vision, and 404 said, can we put it out? And also, do you have a collection? And I was like, yes, because that's always the correct answer. And I started just pulling it together and then typing up and writing new things within a very short space of time, about 2 months, a month, something like that. I hadn't finished Powdered Milk, which is a long story at the end. I just kind of started it, and I just rushed it. Deadlines are good for me, makes me do it. And then was like, here, what do you think of this? I've got no idea. There you go. And they liked it, and they very kindly put it out with the reissue.
There are themes in Mayhem and Death, not themes as such, but almost. Well, there's a lot of animal fables, a lot of dreams, a lot of fantasy, that kind of. Was that deliberate to kind of have that run through them all?
Yes, and there's deliberate kind of images that repeat, like roses.
Yes.
And strangers who you kind of glimpse at the side. I think I just had the idea of how do you build a through line that's not totally overt.
Yes.
And that was what I kind of stuck upon, and it was obviously in my mind as I was writing them all within that 2-year period, and that's, I think it's good to do that, to get your stories at the one time, so it has a feel, it's really a snapshot of the writing life and the reading life and all that at the time.
And there's real mystery, and often the images aren't, you've got to read them a couple of times to go, right, what exactly am I reading here? I think it's a really good thing. And it happened when I started Fresh the Beach, actually, if I remember right, I started reading it, didn't really know what to expect. I mean, I'm going to have to start this again because, it's great because that's someone that's really confounding expectations and making you look at writing in a different way. In terms of using the natural world and the animal world and using them as kind of metaphors and ideas, where did the inspiration for that come from?
I think it's the catastrophe that we're all heading towards.
Yes, excellent.
It's more and more on my mind in the last 2 years, especially, that we're reaching the tipping point where we won't come back, or we'll come back different and really struggling.
Yeah.
And we're just speeding towards that in this 21st century of ours. So I'm more aware of the animals, and they keep coming there as a message that look what humanity is doing.
Yeah.
Look how we're changing their behaviours and making them odd.
Yes.
And making ourselves odd as well. Yeah.
Because I never got the sense of like apocalypse with a big A.
Yeah.
But all the stories individually can be quite distressing, because they're saying, well, these little dramas in everyday life that if they play out, mayhem's a good word for it, because it's all, none of it's what you expect. In writing the shorter fiction, the really short stuff, how do you approach that? Because I would imagine it's very difficult to get over whatever you want to in a page and a half.
I think some stories dictate their own length.
Right.
Mostly. It's very clear as I just start writing. I'll just be like, right, time to write, start writing. And whatever comes out is usually either it's a bit looser and then I know it's for a longer story, or it's this tight, dense stuff, which I think is my mind trying to write poems. But with the narrative drive that's pushing it forward, because I can never escape that drive for narrative. So it's not that it's hard, and actually writing the really intense short stuff is easier than writing a really long thing, mostly.
Okay.
Writing a novel is the hardest thing ever, and don't recommend it to anybody.
But you don't... do you write poetry, or have you been put off by your teenage attempts? Is that still...
Oh, it's an interesting question, because I've just started for the first time in many, many years to write poetry, and I'm building a collection right now after my time in Brazil, which I did a residency, kindly paid for by the Saltire Society.
Whereabouts in Brazil? Where was it?
It's coastal Sao Paulo.
Right.
Beautiful place. The residency is called Caixa. You can go and check it out. They look for international applicants all the time. It's between the beach and the mountains, and in the mountains there are waterfalls, and it's just this gorgeous, chaotic place that's kind of, it's a developing world. Everything is sort of DIY, and like buildings look like they've been turned inside out sometimes.
Because Sao Paulo is huge, isn't it?
Sao Paulo is huge. This is nowhere near Sao Paulo.
Oh, right, I see.
It's in the state of Sao Paulo.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know anything about it. It took me 3 days to work out how to pronounce the place I was in.
Right.
Which is a Boisukanga, incidentally, which means big-headed snake.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So it was.
Is that not what you that's big? It was called big-headed snake.
There's apparently a lot of snakes, but I didn't see any.
Okay.
I did see a tarantula though. So that was. I just started writing these poems, and I'm like, oh, what am I doing now? Normally there's a narrative drive, but it was the idea of the place coming in, because place is always what I'm drawn to.
Yeah, I think, like you say, that really comes across in your writing. You yourself have travelled around. I mean, we've mentioned Sydney and Brazil and Banff and New York. You're originally from Skye.
Well, I grew up there, but I was born in Paisley. I should give a wee shout out to Paisley.
Absolutely.
And I grew up sort of in Edinburgh, then Skye, then Edinburgh again. so bounce
So
about.
how do you think, because they're all very different in terms of the type of places they are, you know? Do you think that was an influence? One, was it an influence on how you saw the world, because you saw very different places? And two, did it give you this desire to travel, which you obviously are?
Yeah, definitely. It made me appreciate that every place is different and has its own qualities and its own language of vocabulary of buildings and people, and the way that people speak is so different between the Highlands and the Lowlands, and the divide is still very firm.
Yes.
You know, and we don't. When you're in the Lowlands, it's almost like the Highlands are invisible.
Yes.
Whereas if you're in the Highlands, you do know that they're there. And so, yeah, it kind of made me hyper aware of that difference. And the way that I spoke was different to the way that people spoke in Edinburgh when I moved down. And I think in writers, if you want to see writers' lives, there's always a crisis moment when they're young, which makes them a writer. And I think that was my moving here to Edinburgh.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So you're always an outsider, perpetually.
And this, you've been in residency in Banff and then in Brazil. Is this something that you kind of want to continue?
Absolutely. I really want to go back to Brazil to research more on the poems and build a collection.
Right.
I'm going to try and do that this year if I can. I've got to get funding.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. And I'm working with a mentor with my poems. So
in Brazil?
No, in here in Edinburgh. Just been kindly put in touch with someone via the Scottish Poetry Library.
Yes,
They've been very helpful. In Brazil, I've got a friend who's a poet, a Brazilian poet. So I'm going to talk with her and see about translation as well, because I love that work of translating things. I got a chance to do that on the residency.
Oh, wow.
And that was absolutely mind-blowing. So yeah, more of that kind of thing and more input. You always need to have input all the time,
yes.
So you've got something interesting to write about.
So, in terms of translating, what was the different approach to that?
Well, I'd never translated anything before. I'm monolingual, unfortunately, unless you count Scots, and that's merely just understanding it.
Paisley and Edinburgh is quite different.
That's very true, yeah. So it was a really interesting experience that was just kind of ad hoc. It was raining a lot when I was in the residency, 4 days straight of solid torrential rain, so you couldn't leave.
Right.
So I got talking to the other artists, and one of the artists and I were decided to work on a translation and record our speaking of this translation, and we split it so that part of the story was in English and part was in Portuguese.
Wow.
It was Take Care, I Love You, which is in Mayhem Death, and so it was a dialogue between two languages, so that the sense of isolation grew even more than it was possible on the page. And I was really excited by that possibility, how moving between languages is isolating and inviting at once.
Isolation is an interesting word to bring up, because I think running through Mayhem and Death is this idea of being isolated, being lonely. At the beginning, again, your dedications are fantastic for the lonely.
Yes.
Was this something that you wanted to explore, and taking on this idea that the book also, in a bigger sense, is about how we're maybe all heading down to apocalypse, increasingly lonely in a world that's like that?
And that's one aspect of it, the environmental loneliness that we are creating. But it's also, in the digital age, the loneliness that exists between people, and the function of literature to bridge that loneliness if it can.
Yes.
Even if it's only in the slightest of ways to say, I am lonely too, or I understand that you are lonely.
Yeah.
Very slight little threads of connection that you can try and do with literature, and that have been the best of literature I've read. A little moment of oh, that's like me. I'm not alone. I'm not a unique,
Someone was asking recently, I was talking about literary fiction, and said, well, what do you mean literary fiction? And I really had to think about that. And I thought, it's stuff that exactly that, it makes you feel empathy on the page of it. Yeah, I felt that way. I have been there too. I've hurt like that. All of those things, and I think that's what it does. I
think that's the great gift of literary fiction that other forms of art cannot give necessarily, or they only give it in a performative sense, briefly in the air, like music. you can kind of get that, but then there's another, it's a deeper form and a quieter form that you get from literary fiction.
And can be quite a devastating form when you read it, because it makes you perhaps, I think when I was reviewing your book, I was saying it asks questions of you that you might not like the answers. When you answer them, I think that's what really good writing can do.
Thank you.
I was talking to someone who had read James Kelman's Dirt Road recently and said they found themselves crying reading the book and they weren't quite sure why. I'm thinking that's exactly it, when it really gets you like that.
Oh yeah, The Remains of the Day is the good example of that too. You're just going along and then suddenly the waterworks and you've reached a threshold and you've crossed over that, and the literature has been slowly working on you to make you understand this mind or this situation.
And you're right, a line in a song can make you choke up or make you, but the full sobbing kind of has to be something a bit more substantial, I think.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask you about then was Jeff Goldblum.
Ah, yes.
So for those who don't know, explain about your Jeff Goldblum connection.
Well, I've written a pamphlet called Goldblum Variations.
Yes.
Title came from Twitter because I didn't think of that, but it was written to a prompt for a podcast. They just said one of my friends was coming on the podcast with me, Gillian Best. She's an excellent author as well.
Yes.
And she said, well, Jeff Goldblum's your prompt. And that was a very slight prompt. But from there, I just started doing these like absurd microfictions about him and things that he could be doing. A little bit after Mayhem and Death was coming together, I said to 404, I've got an idea for a little pamphlet. And they were like, oh, right, okay. I went away in 2 days. I wrote this little collection of absurd, strange things about Jeff. Not really about Jeff Goldblum.
Yes,
really.
absolutely.
But the idea of celebrity and the idea of past lives and points of connection and strangeness, it kind of built from there. And I can probably say now, because I've signed the contract, it's going to be a mini book that's going to be for sale in bookshops now. So that's quite exciting.
And Jeff is aware?
I think he might be.
I think Heather and Laura said that they believe he is aware.
Yeah.
I meant to ask you before we leave Mayhem and Death was about Powdered Milk. So that's the story at the end, and it's a longer story, almost kind of novella length. It's a horror story, really. Tell us a little bit about that, because it feels like it could have been longer, or is it as you said, the length that these are always the length that they're going to be?
These are always the length that they're going to be.
Yeah.
I started with no plan for that one.
Yeah.
It actually ties in with the very first story of Mayhem and Death, Souterrain, which you can kind of pick up as you get to the end, I think. So I started just writing the story, and it suddenly was like grew from the idea of a flash fiction outwards, and it's this how to approach it. It's the story of people trapped basically at the bottom of the sea, and they're on a research base, and it's mostly filtered through the eyes of a character called Maddie, who has taken on the role of the psychologist for the group, although it's maybe not wise that she's in that role. And the kind of attempt of very highly competent people to survive a terrible disaster that is happening to them, that they don't fully understand all of the pieces of. And to kind of build that sense of claustrophobia around that, even as you can see people they're making mostly the right choices at the start.
I mean, again, it's a sense of isolation, but isolation when actually you're forced together with other people.
Yeah.
So this idea that even though I've got all these people around me, I've never felt so alone.
Yes, and I think that's the worst kind, possibly.
And because there's no escape. Well, there's no getting on the bus and saying, well, at least I can go somewhere else and run away.
No exit,
no exit. It's a terrific story. The other one I did want to mention, and I've totally forgotten the name, it's my favourite of the book, but it's the one with the man in the mirror.
Oh, it's A Voice Spoke to Me at Night.
A Voice Spoke to Me at Night. It's a beautiful story. It's about relationship with a stranger over not just distance, but time as well. Explain a little bit about that. Was another one where I'm going to have to go back and read this from the start again. just to make sure I have it clear in my head what I think about it.
Yeah, it's the story of a sort of lonely character who's ungendered, who lives in a modern world,
Yes.
very modern and contemporary, and they have a job that they kind of don't love. They just sort of want to stay under the radar. They're a little bit afraid of everyday existence, and they don't have a lot of strength in themselves, but they're telling themselves that they are coping.
Yes.
And then one day they kind of hear this voice that speaks to them at night, and they think it's their phone, which they regularly just take to bed with them, and it's not their phone. It's a man who is in the mirror, on the other side of the mirror, in the medieval era.
Yeah.
And he's trying to communicate. He is the only survivor in a plague-ridden town, and he's sort of educated. He's speaking to this person in the language of his time.
Yes.
And so they can't understand him. The modern person can't understand him until afterwards, or records him and then understands him. And it's about that gulf of understanding between people, and that attempt that we continually have, and I think we always will have as people, to communicate and offer succour to each other.
Yeah. And there's always a sense of something between us, no matter who it is, whether it's friends, family, strangers, whatever, there's always that kind of potential for misunderstanding because there's that barrier between us, whatever that would be. It's just so beautifully done with the way that these two communicate with each other and kind of heartbreaking at the same time without wanting to give any more away. Can you tell us what you're doing next then, apart from the poetry, or is that the next thing?
Poetry, and I'm also working on a novel, which is going to be in a 3-part structure. Hopefully I've sent a bit of it to my agent, so
right.
We'll see what she says. Then I can talk more about it, but it's a 3-part structure. Each part is novella length, and it's a group of 3 friends who are telling the same story from different angles.
Right.
And it's about love and relationships, but also a fake diary from the 18th century and possible possession by a ghost.
Fantastic.
So we'll see. I mean, I like to start lots of different projects and throw stuff around, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
And see, some of them will take off, and some of them you go, well, no, that's not working. Put it
aside. Maybe cannibalize it later for parts.
I'd also like to talk a little bit about your influences, because your writing seems so individual. I mean, I think now, if someone was to show me a story of your work, I would say that's Helen McClory's work. So what were your influences on your writing, both literary and other influences as well?
I have so many. I think every book I've ever read is fed into the channel. I think everybody says that, though. Virginia Woolf is a big influence when I was younger. Jean Rhys.
Right.
Muriel Spark as well, obviously. That kind of bleakness that I like from the two of them.
Yeah.
Toni Morrison, in terms of here's what really good kind of contemporary fiction can do. I like Leonora Carrington's weirdness.
Right.
She's just getting her big push now. I like surrealist works, anything that does something a bit strange. All the stories that I've read online, little bits of poetry here and there that filter in, and I just kind of process them. And then there's film, which is the biggest influence possibly, and visual art.
Right.
I'm always looking at paintings and kind of respond to a lot of creative works in my stuff.
Yeah.
And reference them all the time, which is probably slightly annoying. And the idea that you have to be intertextual, so I'm like, here, look, you have to go now, look up that picture if you haven't seen it, or go and watch that movie.
Yeah.
I love films. In Mayhem and Death, I reference a few. The stories are directly telling films. Like The Runaway Bride is an influence, even though I hated that film. I can use stuff that I don't like particularly.
Yeah, of course.
Well.
I was just saying, everything kind of has some kind of influence, even if it's going, well, I really disagree with that.
Yeah, here's my thesis about why that's rubbish, but, or, a love letter.
And also, I mean, it's interesting, I think, the way that we now read, because it's not just a book between the pages or a collection of poetry. It is stories online or or someone's Twitter thread even, or so you find that as influential, you know, these little bits and pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah, the idea that our reading is fragmented.
Yeah.
And perhaps that plays into why I always write flash fiction, which is a kind of fragment form perhaps in some ways, and now the poetry. We're shattered in the modern era, and that's okay if you can find ways to be interconnected in your shatteredness. And without that, then you don't realise your humanity. So it's how do you engage with the world without being overwhelmed, because it's very easy to become overwhelmed.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm trying to do too.
It's very difficult to have any kind of filter that actually works. You know, but eventually you've got to decide, you know, I can't watch that 9 series box set of whatever.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to have to let that go.
Yes, exactly. And you have to deal with who you are not having watched it.
Well, talking about different ways of writing and doing things, I'm interested in the idea of the unsung letter.
Yes.
So explain a little bit about that.
Well, having spent a long time in fruitless obscurity, I have a great deal of sympathy and empathy for writers who, having had their book published and writing really good things, have then had zero regard. Yeah. And I want to help them, especially if they are alive, which I think is crucially, they get the most neglect. Yeah. So I've been asking writers and fiction fans of different sorts to write an essay about a book that they love by a writer who's alive, so that people can then go and get that book and realise this beautiful thing is out there. Yeah. I'm taking a slight hiatus on it at the moment because it's quite hard to find people to write for it. Yes. Because I'm asking them to do it for nothing, because I'm doing it for nothing. It's a labour of love, you know. But I feel so strongly about it, to let writers know that somebody loved their book. And I've had feedback from writers who've had people write on them saying, you know, I cried on the train. Yeah. And I just thought that's the mission there. Absolutely.
I mean, one of the things about the website is to support writers that otherwise wouldn't get a voice elsewhere, because the big names still are the ones that go to the front of the queue.
Yes, especially in a small country like Scotland. Yeah. It's very hard to get any kind of traction.
So who would you, here's a question for you, who would you recommend at the moment if you had an unsung letter to write tomorrow? You say, well, I've read this writer, and it's really put you on the spot. I do apologise.
It has put me on the spot. I'm having a wee think. Gosh, who would I put? I've been reading a lot of really old dead white men recently, so it's really hard. But I have been reading, let me get it out. I think it's doing quite well in America. Yes. But Calling a Wolf by Kavi Akbar is a book of poems. He's alive, very much so, and it's about poems about addiction and desire, which I'm very interested in. And the number of poems in here where I've just wanted to take a picture and just like send it to all my friends and be like, look at this poem, it's amazing. It's just astounding. And I think that's the mark of an unsung book.
Definitely, absolutely. You want to share it with others immediately, well, Helen, I think that's the perfect place to end, but thanks so much for talking to us.
Oh, thank you for having a chat, and good questions there.
And we'll be back very soon with someone completely different. Cheers.